If you had to guess the average lifespan of a person living 10,000 years ago, what number would you land on? Most people say somewhere around 30. Some guess even lower, like 25. And on the surface, that seems to line up with everything we've heard about ancient life being brutal, short, and unforgiving. But the real answer is more complicated than that, and it changes depending on what you're actually measuring. Because the number that gets thrown around most often isn't the age most ancient people died. It's a statistical average that gets dragged down hard by one specific thing. And once you understand what that thing is, the entire picture of ancient human health shifts in a direction most people don't expect. Let's start with the number itself. Life expectancy at birth in prehistoric and ancient populations was somewhere between 25 and 35 years, depending on the population and the era. That figure comes from skeletal remains, burial sites, and demographic modeling based on comparative hunter-gatherer societies that survived long enough to be studied. It sounds devastating, but here's the thing about averages. They don't care about the shape of the data underneath them. And in ancient populations, the shape of that data was extreme. Child mortality wasn't just high, it was the single largest driver pulling that average down to a number that looks from the outside. Like nobody made it past middle age. Infant and child death was catastrophic by any modern standard. Roughly 30 to 50% of children born in prehistoric populations didn't survive to their 5th birthday. Some estimates for certain periods go even higher. Infection, injury, difficult births, exposure, starvation during lean seasons, none of those had any real treatment. There were no antibiotics. There were no surgical interventions. A fever that would send a modern child to a hospital and back home in 3 days could and regularly did kill a 2-year-old in a Neolithic village. When you fold that level of early death into a population average, it collapses the number fast. You don't need most adults to die young for the average to land at 30. You just need enough children to die before they get anywhere close to adulthood. So what actually happened to the people who made it through childhood? That's the part that tends to surprise people. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains shows that adults in ancient and prehistoric populations who survived their early years often lived into their 50s, 60s, and sometimes beyond. Studies of hunter-gatherer societies, including groups like the Hadza in Tanzania and the Kungsan in southern Africa, show that once individuals reach adulthood, their expected remaining lifespan isn't dramatically shorter than what we see in some lower-income modern populations. The cliff edge isn't at 30, it's at birth, and it gets progressively less steep with every year a child survives. Now let's talk about what actually killed adults, because the list is different from what most people assume. Violence shows up in the skeletal record, and it's real. Healed fractures, embedded projectile points, skull trauma consistent with blunt force. But violence wasn't the dominant cause of adult death in most populations. The bigger killers were infection, parasitic disease, and the cumulative physical toll of a life lived entirely outdoors under physical strain. Teeth are particularly revealing. Ancient human skulls show severe dental wear, abscesses, and decay caused by diets heavy in grit and plant material. A badly infected tooth today gets pulled in a dentist's chair. 10,000 years ago, it could spread into the jaw, then the bloodstream, and then kill you. Injury was its own category entirely. Without any way to treat broken bones beyond basic splinting, a fall from a height or a hunting accident that fractured a femur could be a death sentence. Not immediately necessarily, but eventually. A person who couldn't walk, couldn't hunt, couldn't gather, and in mobile groups where everyone contributed to survival, being unable to move was a serious problem. Some ancient skeletons do show evidence of healed complex fractures, which means caregiving existed and people did survive serious injuries. But many didn't, and the ones who didn't tend to leave behind the kinds of remains that tell researchers a lot about the physical risks of daily life. Childbirth deserves its own discussion because it was one of the leading causes of death for women in their reproductive years across most of human history. The human skull is large relative to the birth canal, a consequence of millions of years of brain expansion. That mismatch made delivery dangerous in ways that it simply isn't when modern obstetric care is available. Complications that are now routine interventions, placenta previa, prolonged labor, hemorrhage after delivery, killed women regularly. Some demographic models suggest that maternal mortality in pre-agricultural populations may have been high enough that it meaningfully shortened average female lifespan relative to male lifespan, though the picture is complicated and varies significantly by population. Let's talk about the transition to farming, because it did something unexpected. For most of human history, hunter-gatherers were actually better fed than the early farmers who followed them. That's not an intuitive idea, but the skeletal evidence supports it pretty strongly. When populations shifted to agriculture roughly 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and independently in other regions around the same time, their bones got worse. Heights dropped. Dental health declined. Evidence of nutritional deficiency, including conditions like anemia and vitamin deficiencies visible in bone and tooth structure, became more common, not less. Hunter-gatherers ate a wide variety of foods. Early farmers ate mostly whatever crop they were growing. Farming also created a new set of mortality risks that hadn't existed before. Settled populations living near stored grain attracted rodents. Rodents attracted disease vectors. Living in close proximity to domesticated animals, a practice that expanded dramatically with the agricultural revolution, created the conditions for zoonotic diseases to jump to human populations. Measles, smallpox, influenza, and tuberculosis all have origins connected to animal domestication and dense settlement. Hunter-gatherers moving in small mobile groups didn't provide the right conditions for epidemic disease to spread. Early farming villages did. The first cities were also the first places where infectious disease could move through a population fast enough to become a major killer. So why did people farm at all if it was making them shorter and sicker? The answer is probably numbers. Agriculture supports far higher population densities than hunting and gathering. More food per acre of land means more people can survive in one place. And even if each individual was less healthy on average, the total number of people who could exist went up dramatically. That trade-off, lower individual health outcomes in exchange for higher population totals, is one of the more interesting bargains in human history. It's not one anyone consciously made, it just happened, gradually, as groups that farmed outgrew groups that didn't. Parasites are worth pausing on because they're underappreciated as a cause of ancient suffering and death. Intestinal parasites were essentially universal. Coprolites, which are fossilized human feces, and they are exactly what that word sounds like, show evidence of roundworms, tapeworms, whipworms, and other parasites in populations across every continent where analysis has been done. These infections weren't necessarily immediately fatal, but they chronically robbed people of nutrition, weakened immune responses, and made them more vulnerable to everything else. A child who was already borderline malnourished and carrying a heavy parasite load had very little reserve to draw on when a respiratory infection hit. That combination was lethal with a regularity that modern populations in high-income countries have almost entirely forgotten. Environmental exposure was another constant. There was no indoor heating in the modern sense for most of human history. Cold winters in northern latitudes killed people directly, and they killed people indirectly by making food scarcer and bodies weaker. Frostbite, hypothermia, and respiratory infections tied to cold and damp conditions all left their marks. Conversely, populations in tropical regions faced heat, humidity, and the parasitic and infectious disease burdens that come with those environments. Malaria has been traced back hundreds of thousands of years in human populations and is estimated to have killed more individual humans across history than any other single disease. The genetic signature of malaria pressure shows up in blood cell adaptations in populations across Africa, the Mediterranean, and South Asia. Famine is another factor the numbers don't fully capture. Pre-agricultural and early agricultural populations had no way to buffer against failed harvests or prolonged drought beyond what they could store or find elsewhere. Starvation events show up in the skeletal record as lines in tooth enamel called Harris lines, growth arrest lines visible in long bones, and other markers of severe nutritional stress during development. Populations that live through a bad year often carry those marks in their skeletons for the rest of their lives, and populations that didn't survive a bad year didn't leave skeletons at all, which is its own kind of absence in the record. There's also the question of violence at a larger scale. Interpersonal violence existed throughout prehistory, but organized warfare became significantly more common after the agricultural revolution. Settled populations had territory worth defending, stored resources worth raiding, and the population density to field larger groups of fighters. Archaeological sites from the Neolithic period onward show evidence of massacres, fortifications, and weaponry designed specifically for killing people rather than animals. The famous Crow Creek Massacre site in South Dakota, dating to around 1325 CE, contains the remains of nearly 500 individuals showing signs of scalping, dismemberment, and violent death. Warfare as a cause of death scaled up with the complexity of human society. What's striking when you look at all of these causes together is that no single one of them was the whole story. Ancient people didn't die young because of one overwhelming factor. They died from the accumulation of risks that existed without any of the interventions modern medicine takes for granted. A broken leg, a tooth infection, a difficult birth, a bad winter, a waterborne pathogen, a parasitic infection, any one of these could be the thing that ended a life that might otherwise have continued for decades. It wasn't that ancient humans were fundamentally more fragile, it's that every threat they faced was unmediated. Let's talk about the oldest ancient humans who did survive, because they existed and they matter. People in their 60s and 70s appear in the archaeological record across many time periods and populations. At the site of Sunghir in Russia, dated to around 30,000 years ago, researchers found the remains of an older adult male buried with extraordinary care, covered in thousands of ivory beads and grave goods that represented an enormous investment of labor. Someone in that community thought he was worth that. Older individuals in hunter-gatherer societies serve as knowledge repositories, and there's a strong argument that the presence of post-reproductive adults, particularly grandmothers, contributed to child survival in ways that shaped human life history itself. Old age was possible, it just required surviving everything else first. The actual picture of ancient human mortality is less about a world where everyone died at 30, and more about a world where the risks were stacked in ways that killed heavily at the beginning of life and remained serious throughout it. Remove modern childhood vaccination, clean water infrastructure, antibiotics, emergency obstetric care, and surgical infection control, and the numbers we associate with ancient populations start looking a lot more plausible even now. The gap between ancient life expectancy and modern life expectancy is real and it's large, but it's mostly explained by things we've figured out how to prevent in the last 150 years. For most of the time humans have existed, surviving childhood was the hardest part. Everything after that was its own gamble.